Captain Rebecca Martinez had always prided herself on following protocol to the letter. During her 8 years in the Air Force, she'd earned a reputation as one of the most reliable F-16 pilots in the 388th Fighter Wing at Hill Air Force Base. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened during what should have been a routine training exercise over the Nevada desert. It started like any other Tuesday morning briefing. Major Thompson, their commanding officer, stood before the assembled pilots with his usual stern expression. Rebecca sat in the front row, her flight suit crisp and her helmet polished to perfection. The mission seemed straightforward, a formation flight with live fire exercises against ground targets in the restricted airspace of the Nevada test range. Today's exercise will test your ability to coordinate multiple aircraft in a high-stress environment, Thompson explained, clicking through the slide presentation. Martinez, you'll be leading Blue Flight with Lieutenant Davis as your wingman. Red Flight will be commanded by Captain Wilson. Rebecca nodded, making mental notes of the tactical frequencies and target coordinates. She'd flown with Davis before. He was young but competent, with quick reflexes and good situational awareness. Wilson, on the other hand, was known for his aggressive flying style and tendency to push boundaries. Still, he was an experienced pilot with over 200 combat hours. As they walked toward the flight line, Rebecca noticed something odd about the aircraft assignments. Her usual F-16C, tail number 892147, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she was assigned to an aircraft she'd never flown before, 910376. The maintenance chief, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, handed her the aircraft forms with an expression she couldn't quite read. "This bird's been in depot maintenance for 6 months," Rodriguez said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Just came back yesterday. Everything checks out, but—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Just be careful up there, Captain. Something doesn't feel right about this whole setup." Rebecca frowned. Rodriguez had been maintaining F-16s for 15 years, and she'd never known him to be paranoid without good reason. She flipped through the maintenance logs, noting several unusual entries. The aircraft had undergone extensive avionics upgrades, including systems she wasn't familiar with. More concerning were the classified modification codes that required security clearances she didn't possess. "What kind of upgrades are we talking about?" she asked, but Rodriguez just shook his head. "Above my pay grade, Captain. All I know is that 3 different contractor teams worked on this aircraft, and they all had to sign additional non-disclosure agreements. The whole thing was compartmentalized. Nobody saw the big picture except the project managers." As Rebecca performed her pre-flight inspection, she noticed subtle differences in the aircraft's external appearance. The radar warning receiver antennas were in slightly different positions, and there were additional access panels she'd never seen before. The cockpit looked familiar at first glance, but as she settled into the ejection seat, she realized that several display screens showed different menu options than she was accustomed to. The engine start sequence proceeded normally, but as the sophisticated avionics systems came online, Rebecca began to understand why Rodriguez had seemed nervous. Her heads-up display showed targeting capabilities that weren't supposed to exist on a standard F-16C. The electronic warfare suite included countermeasures that were still classified as experimental. Most disturbing of all was a weapons selection menu that included ordnance types she'd never been trained to employ. Lieutenant Davis's voice crackled over the radio as they taxied toward the runway. "Blue lead. My systems are showing some unusual configurations. Are you seeing the same thing?" Rebecca keyed her microphone, choosing her words carefully. "Blue 2, maintain radio discipline. We'll discuss any irregularities during the post-flight debrief." But privately, she was beginning to wonder if this training exercise was something much more significant than anyone had told them. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and Rebecca advanced the throttle, feeling the familiar surge of power as the F-16's engine spooled up. As they climbed into the clear desert sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to become involved in something that would change her career forever. 20 minutes into the flight, as they approached the target area, Rebecca's worst fears were confirmed. Her secure communications panel suddenly activated, displaying a message that made her blood run cold. Authorization required for classified weapon system employment. She wasn't flying a standard F-16C at all. This was a prototype aircraft equipped with experimental weapons that weren't supposed to exist in the official inventory. And somehow, she and Davis had been selected to test these systems without their knowledge or consent. The implications were staggering. If this was an unauthorized test program, it would violate numerous military regulations and potentially several international treaties. But if it was authorized, then someone had deliberately kept the pilots in the dark about the true nature of their mission. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she realized the position she'd been put in. She could either complete the mission as briefed, effectively becoming an unwitting participant in what might be an illegal weapons test, or she could abort the exercise and face the consequences of disobeying orders. As she wrestled with this decision, Captain Wilson's voice came over the radio with an urgency that immediately caught her attention. "All flights, this is Red Lead. I've got multiple unknown aircraft approaching from the northeast. They're not squawking friendly IFF codes." Rebecca's heart rate spiked as she switched her radar to air-to-air mode. Sure enough, her scope showed 4 fast-moving contacts that weren't part of the scheduled exercise. But what made her situation even more complicated was the fact that her prototype aircraft's weapon systems were automatically recommending engagement options that included the classified ordnance she wasn't supposed to know about. The unknown aircraft continued their approach, and Rebecca realized she was about to face a choice that would define not just her career, but potentially the lives of everyone involved in this mysterious exercise. In the space of a few seconds, what had started as a routine training flight had become something much more dangerous and morally complex. Rebecca gripped her control stick tighter, knowing that whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the simple certainty of following orders without question. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent transmissions as the situation continued to escalate, and Rebecca found herself wondering if she was about to uncover a conspiracy that reached far beyond anything she could have imagined. As the unknown aircraft closed to within weapon range, Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. Instead of immediately engaging, she switched to a secure frequency and transmitted a message that would expose the entire operation. Control, this is Blue Lead. I need immediate clarification on the authority for employment of experimental weapon systems. The response she received would shake her faith in the chain of command and force her to choose between following orders and following her conscience. Rebecca's request for clarification was met with dead silence over the secure frequency. For 30 seconds that felt like an eternity, she and Davis maintained formation while the unknown aircraft continued their approach. Finally, a voice she didn't recognize came over the radio with an authority that made her spine stiffen. Blue Lead, this is Shadowbox Control. You will maintain radio silence and engage targets as directed. Your clearance level is not sufficient for further information. The call sign was unfamiliar, and the voice belonged to someone who wasn't part of the normal chain of command for training exercises. Rebecca's suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't a standard military operation. Someone was using her and Davis as unwitting test pilots for weapon systems that existed outside the normal procurement and authorization process. But the ethical implications became even more complex when she realized that the approaching aircraft might not be adversaries at all. Their flight patterns suggested they were also conducting some kind of test or evaluation, and engaging them with experimental weapons could result in friendly fire incidents that would be covered up to protect the classified program. Rebecca made a split-second decision that would define her military career and potentially expose a shadow program that operated outside congressional oversight. She switched to the emergency frequency and broadcast a message that would force the entire operation into the open. Any station, any station. This is Air Force Captain Rebecca Martinez. Tail number 910376. I am currently flying an unauthorized prototype aircraft equipped with experimental weapons systems. I believe I am being used as an unwitting test subject in a classified program that may violate military regulations and congressional oversight requirements. The response was immediate and intense. Multiple voices began transmitting simultaneously, some ordering her to cease radio transmissions, others demanding identification codes, and still others trying to jam her communications. But Rebecca had already accomplished her goal. She had created a permanent record of the situation that couldn't be easily covered up. Lieutenant Davis, monitoring the same frequencies, made his own decision to support his flight leader. This is Blue 2, confirming Blue Lead's transmission. I am also flying a prototype aircraft with unknown capabilities. We request immediate clarification from proper authority before proceeding with any weapons employment. The situation had now escalated beyond anyone's ability to control through normal channels. Rebecca and Davis had forced the Shadow program into the open, but they had also put themselves in extreme danger from both the unknown aircraft and the people running the classified operation. As the minutes passed, it became clear that Rebecca's decision to expose the program had created a crisis that reached the highest levels of the military command structure. Her radio began receiving transmissions from officers whose voices she recognized from Pentagon briefings, all demanding immediate compliance with the original mission parameters. But Rebecca had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had chosen to prioritize her oath to the Constitution over her obligation to follow orders, and now she would have to live with the consequences of that choice. The unknown aircraft had changed their flight pattern in response to the radio transmissions, and Rebecca realized they were also part of the same Shadow program. The entire exercise had been designed to test not just the prototype weapon systems, but also the willingness of military personnel to participate in unauthorized operations without asking questions. As she and Davis continued to circle the target area, Rebecca began to understand the full scope of what she had uncovered. This wasn't just about experimental weapons. It was about the systematic circumvention of military oversight and the use of service members as unwitting participants in programs that existed outside the normal chain of command. The radio traffic continued to intensify, and Rebecca knew that her decision to expose the program had created a crisis that would ultimately require intervention from the highest levels of government. But she also knew that she had done the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. In the end, her choice to prioritize truth over obedience would expose a network of unauthorized military programs and lead to congressional investigations that would reshape how classified operations were conducted and overseen. Rebecca Martinez had entered the cockpit that morning as a loyal military officer following orders. She would land as a whistleblower who had chosen conscience over career, forever changing not just her own life, but the lives of everyone involved in the shadow programs that operated in the dark corners of the military-industrial complex. The desert sky around her F-16 had become a battlefield not just for experimental weapons, but for the very soul of military accountability and the principle that even classified operations must operate within the bounds of law and constitutional oversight. As she prepared for whatever consequences awaited her on the ground, Rebecca Martinez knew that she had honored her oath to defend the Constitution, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had worked for in her military career. The story of what happened that day over the Nevada desert would eventually become a case study in military ethics and the importance of individual conscience in the face of institutional pressure to remain silent about illegal or unauthorized activities. Within hours of landing, Rebecca Martinez found herself sitting in a windowless room at Hill Air Force Base, facing a panel of officers whose ranks and insignia told her that this situation had escalated far beyond a simple training exercise gone wrong. Colonel Patricia Williams, the wing commander, sat at the center of the table with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been respect. "Captain Martinez," Williams began, her voice carefully controlled, "you've created quite a situation. There are people in Washington who are very interested in your actions today." Rebecca sat at attention, her hands folded in her lap. She had spent the 3 hours since landing thinking about what she would say in this moment, and she had decided that honesty was the only path forward, regardless of the consequences. "Ma'am, I followed my oath to defend the Constitution. When I realized I was being used as an unwitting test subject in an unauthorized program, I felt obligated to bring it to the attention of proper authority." A man in a civilian suit, who hadn't been introduced, leaned forward. "Captain, do you understand the potential damage your actions have caused to national security programs that are vital to our defense capabilities?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I understand that there are programs that require classification for legitimate national security reasons. What I don't understand is how those programs can operate without proper oversight and authorization, or how service members can be used as test subjects without their knowledge or consent." Colonel Williams glanced at the civilian before continuing. "The program you were involved in today has been operating under special authorization from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Your concerns about oversight are noted, but they reflect a misunderstanding of how certain classified programs are managed." "With respect, ma'am," Rebecca replied, I've held a top-secret clearance for 6 years. I understand compartmentalization and need-to-know principles. But I also know that there are legal requirements for congressional notification and oversight, even for the most sensitive programs. If this program was properly authorized, then someone should have been able to provide that information when I requested it. The room fell silent for a long moment. Rebecca could hear the ventilation system humming and the distant sound of aircraft operations continuing outside. Finally, the civilian spoke again. "Captain Martinez, you've put us in a difficult position. The program you've exposed has been operating for 3 years under what we believed to be proper authority. Your actions today have forced us to conduct an immediate review of that authorization." Rebecca felt a chill of realization. Are you saying that the program might not have been properly authorized? Colonel Williams exchanged glances with the other officers at the table. What I'm saying is that your actions have initiated a review process that was probably overdue. The question now is what we do with you while that review is conducted. Over the following days, Rebecca found herself in a peculiar form of administrative limbo. She wasn't under arrest, but she wasn't free to discuss the incident with anyone outside the investigation team. Lieutenant Davis was in a similar situation, though he had been assigned to different debriefing sessions to prevent them from coordinating their accounts. The investigation team grew daily, eventually including representatives from the Inspector General's office, the Government Accountability Office, and several congressional oversight committees. Rebecca found herself repeating her account of the day's events dozens of times, each time to different groups of investigators with different areas of focus. What emerged from these sessions was a picture of a defense contractor system that had gradually expanded beyond its original scope and authorization. The prototype aircraft Rebecca had flown was part of a program that had begun as a legitimate research and development effort, but had evolved into operational testing without proper oversight or approval. The contractors involved had been operating under the assumption that their government liaisons had obtained all necessary authorizations, while the government personnel had been told that the contractors were handling the legal and oversight requirements. The result was a program that existed in a gray area where no one had taken responsibility for ensuring proper authorization. Rebecca's decision to expose the program had forced all parties to confront the fact that they had been operating without the legal framework that was supposed to govern such activities. The weapons systems she had been asked to test were legitimate military technology, but the testing process had bypassed the safety protocols and authorization procedures that were designed to protect both the test subjects and the broader military organization. As weeks passed, Rebecca began to understand that her actions had triggered a much larger examination of how classified programs were managed and overseen. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and several high-ranking officials found themselves having to explain how such a program had been allowed to operate without proper oversight. The personal cost to Rebecca was significant. Her career progression was effectively frozen while the investigation continued, and she found herself isolated from her normal duties and colleagues. Some fellow officers viewed her as a whistleblower who had violated the trust and loyalty that were fundamental to military service, while others saw her as someone who had courageously exposed a dangerous breakdown in the system of checks and balances. Lieutenant Davis, meanwhile, had chosen a different path. While he supported Rebecca's account of what had happened, he had not initiated the exposure of the program and was being treated more as a witness than as a primary actor in the incident. This difference in treatment highlighted the personal cost of Rebecca's decision to prioritize transparency over loyalty to the chain of command. As the investigation expanded, Rebecca learned that the program she had exposed was just one of several similar efforts that had been operating in the gray areas of military oversight. Her actions had not only forced accountability for this specific program, but had also triggered a broader review of how classified research and development programs were managed and overseen. The desert training exercise that had begun as a routine flight had become a catalyst for examining fundamental questions about military accountability, congressional oversight, and the balance between national security needs and democratic governance. Rebecca Martinez had never intended to become a symbol of these larger issues, but her split-second decision to prioritize truth over obedience had made her exactly that. As she waited for the investigation to conclude and her fate to be determined, Rebecca reflected on the choice she had made in the cockpit that day. She had no regrets about exposing the unauthorized program, but she was beginning to understand the full cost of standing up for principles in an institution that valued loyalty and order above individual conscience. The story of what happened over the Nevada desert would eventually become a case study in military ethics courses and congressional oversight hearings. But for Rebecca Martinez, it remained the defining moment when she chose to honor her oath to the Constitution, regardless of the personal consequences. 6 months after the incident, Rebecca Martinez received orders that would change her life in ways she never could have anticipated. Instead of the disciplinary action she had expected, she was being assigned to a newly created position within the Air Force Inspector General's office, specifically focused on oversight of classified research and development programs. Colonel Williams delivered the news personally, her expression softer than it had been during those first tense meetings after the incident. Captain Martinez, The investigation you initiated has led to significant changes in how we manage classified programs. The Secretary of Defense has decided that your experience and demonstrated commitment to proper oversight make you uniquely qualified to help prevent similar situations in the future. Rebecca was stunned. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. I thought my career was effectively over." "Your career as a traditional fighter pilot might be over," Williams replied, "but your career as a military professional is just beginning a new phase. The investigation revealed that the program you exposed was one of 17 similar efforts that were operating without proper oversight. The Department of Defense needs officers with your integrity and courage to ensure this doesn't happen again." The new position would require Rebecca to work closely with congressional oversight committees, defense contractors, and military research facilities to ensure that classified programs operated within proper legal and ethical frameworks. It was a role that would utilize her technical background while drawing on the moral courage she had demonstrated over the Nevada desert. Lieutenant Davis, meanwhile, had been selected for a different but related assignment. His support of Rebecca's actions and his detailed technical knowledge of the prototype systems had earned him a position with the Defense Contract Management Agency, where he would be responsible for ensuring that contractor testing programs complied with all applicable regulations and safety protocols. As Rebecca prepared for her new role, she began to understand the broader implications of what she had uncovered. The shadow programs that had operated without proper oversight weren't the result of deliberate wrongdoing, but rather of a system that had grown so complex and compartmentalized that no one had maintained overall responsibility for ensuring legal compliance. Her first assignment in the new position involved traveling to defense contractors across the country, reviewing their classified programs to ensure they had proper authorization and oversight. What she found was a pattern of well-intentioned programs that had gradually expanded beyond their original scope, often without anyone realizing that they had crossed legal or ethical boundaries. The contractors were generally cooperative, recognizing that proper oversight was in their own best interests. Most had been operating under the assumption that the military personnel they worked with had obtained all necessary authorizations, and they were relieved to have clear procedures for verifying that such authorizations existed. Rebecca's technical background as a pilot proved invaluable in these reviews. She could understand the complex systems being developed and tested, while also recognizing when safety protocols or authorization procedures had been bypassed or ignored. Her reputation as someone who had been willing to sacrifice her career for principle gave her credibility with both contractors and military personnel. One of the most significant cases she worked on involved a contractor that had been developing advanced electronic warfare systems. The company had been testing these systems on military aircraft without proper authorization, believing that their government liaisons had obtained all necessary approvals. When Rebecca's review revealed that no such approvals existed, the contractor voluntarily suspended the program until proper authorization could be obtained. This case became a model for how similar situations should be handled. Instead of punishing the contractor or the military personnel involved, the focus was on establishing clear procedures to prevent such misunderstandings in the future. The contractor worked with Rebecca's team to develop a comprehensive oversight framework that was eventually adopted across the defense industry. Rebecca's work also involved testifying before congressional committees about the reforms that had been implemented following her exposure of the original program. These hearings were sometimes contentious, with some members of Congress questioning whether the military could be trusted to police itself, while others worried that excessive oversight might hamper legitimate national security programs. Rebecca found herself in the unique position of defending both the need for strong oversight and the legitimacy of classified programs that served important national security functions. Her testimony helped Congress understand that the goal wasn't to eliminate classified programs, but to ensure that they operated within proper legal and ethical frameworks. The personal cost of Rebecca's choice continued to manifest in unexpected ways. Some of her former colleagues viewed her new role with suspicion, seeing her as someone who had broken the bonds of military loyalty. Others, however, began to approach her with concerns about programs they were involved in, seeking guidance on how to raise questions without jeopardizing their careers. Rebecca worked to establish formal channels for military personnel to report concerns about classified programs without fear of retaliation. This involved creating training programs that helped service members understand the difference between legitimate classification requirements and improper use of classification to hide illegal or unauthorized activities. The success of these programs was measured not just in the number of problems they identified, but in the number of potential problems they prevented. By creating clear procedures for authorization and oversight, the military was able to maintain the security of legitimate classified programs while ensuring that they operated within proper legal frameworks. Rebecca's story became a case study in military ethics courses, highlighting the importance of individual moral courage in maintaining institutional integrity. Her decision to prioritize constitutional principles over institutional loyalty had not only exposed a specific problem, but had also led to systemic reforms that strengthened democratic oversight of military programs. As she reflected on the path that had led her from the cockpit of an F-16 to a desk in the Inspector General's office, Rebecca realized that her moment of moral clarity over the Nevada desert had been the beginning of a career that was far more meaningful than anything she had originally planned. The experimental weapons systems she had been asked to test that day had eventually been properly authorized and deployed, but only after undergoing the oversight and safety reviews that should have been conducted from the beginning. The shadow programs that had operated without proper authorization had been brought into compliance with legal requirements, and new procedures had been established to prevent similar situations in the future. Rebecca Martinez had entered that cockpit as a fighter pilot following orders. She had emerged as a guardian of the principle that even the most classified military programs must operate within the bounds of law and constitutional oversight. Her choice to speak truth to power had not only saved her own integrity, but had also strengthened the democratic institutions that govern military power in a free society. 2 years after the Nevada incident, Rebecca Martinez stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, delivering a lecture that would become part of the core curriculum for future military officers. The topic was moral courage in military service, and her personal experience had made her one of the most sought-after speakers on the subject. "The oath we take as military officers," she told the assembled cadets, "is not primarily to our superiors or to the institution we serve. It is to the Constitution of the United States. When those loyalties conflict, the Constitution must take precedence, regardless of the personal cost." In the audience, she could see the same mix of idealism and uncertainty that she had felt as a young officer. These cadets would face their own moments of moral choice, and she wanted them to understand that integrity wasn't just about following rules, but about having the courage to question orders when they conflicted with fundamental principles. The reforms that had followed Rebecca's exposure of the unauthorized program had been comprehensive and lasting. The Department of Defense had established new oversight procedures for classified research and development programs, including regular audits and mandatory reporting requirements that ensured proper authorization and congressional notification. More importantly, the military had created formal protections for service members who reported concerns about potentially unauthorized activities. The fear of retaliation that had made Rebecca's decision so difficult was no longer a barrier to reporting legitimate concerns about program authorization and oversight. Rebecca's new role had evolved beyond simple oversight to include policy development and training. She worked with military leadership to establish clear guidelines for when and how classified programs could be initiated, ensuring that proper authorization was obtained before any testing or deployment activities began. Her work had also extended to the international arena, where she helped develop agreements with allied nations for joint classified programs. These agreements included provisions for mutual oversight and accountability, ensuring that international collaborative programs operated within the legal frameworks of all participating nations. The personal transformation that had begun in the cockpit over Nevada continued to shape Rebecca's understanding of military service. She had learned that true loyalty to the military meant holding it accountable to the highest standards of integrity and constitutional compliance, even when that accountability required difficult choices. Lieutenant Davis, now Captain Davis, had also found his career transformed by the events of that day. His work with defense contractors had led to the development of new safety protocols for weapons testing that protected both test subjects and the broader public from the risks of unauthorized or improperly conducted experiments. The two officers had remained in contact, occasionally working together on cases that involved both oversight and technical evaluation. Their partnership had become a model for how military personnel could maintain professional relationships while supporting each other's commitment to institutional integrity. Rebecca's family had initially struggled to understand her decision to sacrifice a promising career as a fighter pilot for what seemed like a thankless role in oversight and accountability. Over time, however, they had come to appreciate the significance of her contribution to military reform and democratic governance. Her father, a veteran of the Vietnam War, had been particularly proud of her choice to prioritize constitutional principles over institutional loyalty. He had seen firsthand how the military's effectiveness depended on maintaining the trust of the American people, and he understood that Rebecca's actions had helped preserve that trust. The congressional hearings that had followed the exposure of the unauthorized program had led to significant legislative reforms in how classified programs were managed and overseen. These reforms had strengthened congressional oversight while preserving the military's ability to conduct legitimate classified research and development activities. Rebecca had testified before Congress multiple times, helping legislators understand the technical complexities of military programs, while emphasizing the importance of maintaining proper legal and ethical frameworks. Her testimony had been instrumental in crafting legislation that balanced national security needs with democratic accountability. The defense contractors who had been involved in the unauthorized program had become some of the strongest supporters of the new oversight procedures. They had recognized that proper authorization and oversight protected them from legal liability while ensuring that their work contributed to legitimate national security objectives. Rebecca's reputation within the military had gradually shifted from that of a troublemaker to that of a reformer who had strengthened the institution, by holding it accountable to its highest ideals. Her willingness to sacrifice her career for principle had ultimately enhanced her career by opening opportunities that would never have existed within the traditional fighter-pilot community. As she concluded her lecture to the cadets, Rebecca emphasized the lesson that had emerged from her experience. Military service is not about blind obedience to authority. It is about intelligent loyalty to the principles that make our nation worth defending. When we encounter situations where those principles are at risk, we have an obligation to act, regardless of the personal cost. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, reflecting the cadets' understanding that they were hearing from someone who had faced the ultimate test of military integrity and had chosen courage over comfort. Rebecca Martinez had become a symbol of the principle that moral courage was not just a personal virtue, but a professional requirement for military officers in a democratic society. Her story continued to inspire military personnel at all levels to recognize that their oath to the Constitution required them to maintain vigilance against the abuse of power, even when that vigilance required them to challenge the very institutions they served. The experimental weapons program that had begun her journey had been properly authorized and successfully deployed, but only after undergoing the oversight and accountability measures that should have been in place from the beginning. Rebecca Martinez had transformed from a pilot who followed orders to a leader who ensured that orders were worth following. Her moment of moral clarity over the Nevada desert had become a catalyst for institutional reform that strengthened both military effectiveness and democratic governance. The ripple effects of Rebecca's decision continued to spread throughout the military and defense establishment. 5 years after the Nevada incident, she found herself promoted to major and assigned to the Pentagon, where she served as the primary liaison between the military and congressional oversight committees on classified program authorization. Her office in the Pentagon was modest but strategically located, reflecting her role as a bridge between the military establishment and the civilian oversight that was essential to democratic governance. The walls were decorated with photos from her flying days, a reminder of the career she had sacrificed to preserve the integrity of the institution she served. One of her most significant achievements was the development of what became known as the Martinez Protocol, a comprehensive framework for ensuring that classified programs operated within proper legal and ethical boundaries. This protocol required multiple levels of authorization and regular review, making it virtually impossible for programs to operate without proper oversight. The protocol had been tested numerous times since its implementation, and in each case, it had successfully identified and corrected situations where programs had begun to operate outside their authorized parameters. The early detection and correction of these problems had prevented the kind of crisis that Rebecca had faced over the Nevada desert. Rebecca's work had also influenced international military cooperation. Allied nations had adopted similar oversight procedures for their classified programs, creating a global network of accountability that strengthened military effectiveness while preserving democratic control over military power. The personal cost of Rebecca's choice had been significant but not permanent. Her marriage to a fellow Air Force officer had survived the stress of the investigation and the career changes that followed. Her husband, Colonel James Martinez, had been supportive of her decision from the beginning, recognizing that her integrity was one of the qualities that had attracted him to her in the first place. Their children had grown up understanding that their mother was someone who had chosen to do the right thing even when it was difficult. This lesson had shaped their own understanding of integrity and civic responsibility, creating a legacy that extended beyond Rebecca's professional achievements. Rebecca's former colleagues had gradually come to appreciate the reforms that had resulted from her actions. The clear procedures for program authorization and oversight had eliminated the uncertainty and legal risk that had previously surrounded classified programs. Military personnel could now be confident that the programs they worked on had proper authorization and legal support. The defense contractors who worked on classified programs had also benefited from the reforms. Clear procedures for authorization and oversight had reduced their legal liability while ensuring that their work contributed to legitimate national security objectives. The industry had become more efficient and effective as a result of the clarity that the reforms had provided. Rebecca's role in the Pentagon included regular briefings for senior military leadership on the status of classified programs and their compliance with oversight requirements. These briefings had become models of how complex technical information could be presented in ways that supported informed decision-making while maintaining necessary security classifications. Her testimony before Congress had evolved from crisis management to routine oversight, reflecting the success of the reforms in preventing the kinds of problems that had originally brought her to congressional attention. The legislators who had initially been skeptical of military accountability had become supporters of the oversight system that Rebecca had helped create. The experimental weapons systems that had been at the center of the original incident had eventually been successfully deployed, but only after undergoing the proper testing and evaluation procedures. The delay caused by the investigation and reform process had ultimately resulted in more effective and safer weapons systems that better served military objectives. Rebecca's story had become a case study not just in military ethics courses, but in public administration and government oversight programs. Her experience demonstrated how individual moral courage could catalyze institutional reform that strengthened democratic governance while preserving essential security functions. The long-term impact of Rebecca's decision extended beyond the military to influence how other government agencies approached the balance between security and accountability. Her example had inspired similar reforms in intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and other areas where classified operations required careful oversight. As Rebecca prepared for her next assignment, a command position that would put her in charge of oversight for all classified research and development programs, she reflected on the journey that had begun with a routine training flight over the Nevada desert. Her decision to prioritize constitutional principles over institutional loyalty had not only preserved her own integrity, but had also strengthened the democratic institutions that governed military power. The young pilot who had questioned unauthorized weapons testing had become a senior officer responsible for ensuring that such situations never occurred again. Her transformation from follower to leader had been painful but necessary, demonstrating that moral courage was not just a personal virtue, but a professional requirement for military officers in a democratic society. Rebecca Martinez had learned that true military effectiveness required not just technical competence and tactical skill, but also the moral courage to hold the institution accountable to its highest ideals. Her legacy would be measured not just in the problems she had exposed, but in the problems she had prevented through her commitment to integrity and constitutional governance. The story of what happened over the Nevada desert had become more than just an account of one officer's moral choice. It had become a testament to the principle that democratic institutions depend on individuals who are willing to sacrifice personal advancement for the greater good of constitutional governance and institutional integrity. 10 years after the Nevada incident, Rebecca Martinez, now Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from the President of the United States. The citation read, "For extraordinary courage in exposing unauthorized military programs and catalyzing comprehensive reforms that strengthened democratic oversight of national security activities while preserving essential defense capabilities." The ceremony was attended by military leaders, members of Congress, and the defense contractors who had worked with Rebecca to implement the reforms that had emerged from her actions. Also present were the cadets and officers who had been inspired by her example to prioritize integrity over institutional loyalty. In her acceptance speech, Rebecca emphasized that the medal belonged not just to her, but to all the military personnel who had supported the reforms and the civilian leaders who had worked to strengthen oversight of classified programs. This recognition belongs to everyone who believes that military effectiveness depends on maintaining the trust of the American people through transparency and accountability. The reforms that had begun with Rebecca's exposure of the unauthorized weapons program had become a model for democratic oversight of military activities worldwide. International military organizations had adopted similar procedures, creating a global framework for ensuring that classified programs operated within proper legal and ethical boundaries. Rebecca's career had evolved beyond oversight to include policy development and international cooperation. She had become one of the military's most respected experts on the balance between security requirements and democratic accountability, advising senior leadership on how to maintain both effectiveness and integrity. The experimental weapons systems that had been at the center of the original incident had proven to be highly effective in military operations, but their success was measured not just in tactical effectiveness, but in the fact that they had been developed and deployed within proper legal and ethical frameworks. The defense contractors who had initially been involved in the unauthorized program had become leaders in implementing accountability measures throughout the industry. Their experience had taught them that proper oversight was not an obstacle to innovation, but a foundation for sustainable and effective military capabilities. Rebecca's family had watched her transformation from fighter pilot to institutional reformer with pride and understanding. Her children had grown up knowing that their mother was someone who had chosen to do the right thing regardless of personal cost, and this lesson had shaped their own understanding of civic responsibility and moral courage. The congressional oversight committees that had initially been skeptical of military accountability had become partners in maintaining the balance between security requirements and democratic governance. The reforms that Rebecca had catalyzed had proven that effective oversight could strengthen rather than weaken national security capabilities. Rebecca's former colleagues in the